Qualquer pessoa com a ajuda certa pode programar. É o que pensa a web designer Helen Holmes, dos Estados Unidos, uma das palestrantes da BrazilJS 2016. Trabalhando atualmente na Mozilla, ela ajuda a transformar developer tools em ferramentas mais acessíveis a públicos distintos. Além disso, usa o conhecimento que tem com o objetivo de tornar o ambiente tecnológico mais amigável. Para isso, Helen participa de ações inclusivas e orientações a estudantes em maratonas e hackathons por escolas de seu país.
All right. Hey, everyone. This talk is Type is Your Right. I'm Helen, and I love good typography. So content is the most important thing on your site, but typography is how you dress it up. The clothes you put on every morning express purpose for your day and what typography does, and that's exactly what typography does for your content. Assuming you're not just using emojis to express semantic meaning on your sites, you're using typography, and it's that same typography that's in the equation of what's making your users feel like using your site in the first place. So, and if you're like me, you want type that makes your users feel good, and you want type that you want type that's beautiful. So that's all well and good, you might say, but what does it mean to have beautiful web typography? What are the steps from going from knowing relatively little about typography to making typefaces beautiful? It would also be pretty valid to ask, fancy web type means HTTP requests and additional load time and potentially poor user experience. How can I be sure that I'm making all of it performant? So typography doesn't just exist on the web. If you want beautiful web typography, you need to get beautiful typography first. And as with most things in life, having a little history doesn't hurt. Gutenberg and his printing press marked the birth of modern typography, but written language stretches way further back than the 15th century. Before Gutenberg, religious men all over the world were trying to pen history by hand. Calligraphy, the art typography sought to modernize, is really, really old. So, yeah, written word, it's hell old. So do I have any UX designers in the audience? Raise your hand. I'm a UX designer. Cool. There's some UXers here. So when you're trying to create a new website or a new app, you draw from patterns you've already seen in other places that work well. This is because choosing patterns users are familiar with helps them acclimate to your product faster. This slide is a little crazy, but it's just showing that, like, on iOS, everyone sort of has the exact same kind of navigation. So typography over the years did the exact same thing. It copied from predecessors. Those religious men who were penning history created letters and alphabets and the words and the way that things looked on the page. When the technical revolution hits, it copies what these men had been doing, and even now typography draws inspiration from the way we write on paper. That technical revolution, that's Gutenberg, and that's where typography begins. So typography copying the way we write and technical revolution means 3 patterns emerge. The first is typography and what we as readers find legible change and morph together and are influenced by how we're reading content. So be it by book, newspaper, or by website. The second is that typography is also influenced by the way people write by hand, and it borrows solutions people find when writing by hand when it needs them. And then third, it's that typography nonetheless becomes fundamentally different from the traditional written calligraphy because of the ways printing presses work. So instead of letters being coupled really closely together, printing presses force each letter to be in an individual metal box called a slug. So I found this really great tweet the other day. It's the difference between what you see on a keyboard and what is available in a font is often staggering. So there in the red, we see everything we're used to seeing on our keyboard, and then there's just everything else. So if we think of this phenomenon as something that happened because typography was copying a previously established rich art, it all makes sense. All of those extra things you don't see in a font are problems that people, when they're writing by hand, just solve with a pen. But when you need to fit everything into a keyboard, it becomes more complicated. Like this guy, for example, very talented. When we look at all of the glyphs and characters that a font has, when we look at all of the features a font might have, you can understand their relevance and the functions they serve a reader by keeping those three facts in mind. So typography needed to create glyphs, it needed to create characters, and it needed to create them for all these permutations that we create when we write. And it was challenging because printing presses meant you needed to have every single character in a little metal box. So before we get to what all of those things are, let's brush up on our 15th century European history and talk a little bit about this guy, Johannes Gutenberg. So the question is, why did the printing press change written word so much? So to understand how we got from calligraphy to typography, it's helpful to understand how a printing press works. To print books on a printing press, you set these metal bars called slugs, each with a letter or combination of letters in rows. And it sort of looks like this. And it's set up this way so that they can be movable and interchangeable, because every page is different. Written word before the printing press, it was really awkward to fix spacing between letters. And acronyms in body of text flowed, and if you were talented, adding flourishes to your work was really simple. Printing presses' needs were very different. Typography needed to solve awkward spacing and build flourishes and have number fractions, all of the things that were easy to solve when you're just writing, but not as easy to typeset. Ellen Lupton in her book, Thinking with Type, puts this really elegantly. She says, the first typefaces were directly modeled on forms of calligraphy. Typefaces, however, are not bodily gestures. They are manufactured images designed for infinite repetition. So to solve these issues, type designers had to create all the glyphs that you can find in fonts today. Like we saw in this tweet, you need to make all of these things. And slugs meant that as a type designer, you had to choose and find important combinations of letters. You had to give decorative glyphs for people printing books. You needed to create small caps. You needed to create often used fractions. So if it wasn't obvious, this is the direction we're heading in with this talk. These things make your content shine. Using these beautiful little characters that were specially created to solve specific kinds of problems makes your text more legible, and it makes the details more beautiful. So the need for these sort of characters didn't go away when we switched to digital typography, which is why the ability to turn these features on and off in CSS exists. So when we use typography on the web, we have a myriad of characters and glyphs at our disposal, all of which can be turned on and off with OpenType CSS flags. So there are actually like a bunch of them. There are like over 100, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but we can at least learn about a few of like the most common ones. So one of them is kerning, which is the adjustment between spacing, so letters look good. Here you can see it applied and not applied across a few different things. Type designers will put a lot of work into figuring out spacing between your letters, so it makes sense to turn this on to auto, which ensures the browser will choose the most performant kerning option by default. There are also ligatures, which fix awkward letter combinations. This one's a little hard to see, but you'll notice it on the F and the I. When type gets really small, spacing gets awkward between certain letter combinations, and ligatures fix that. They are normally split into normal and discretionary ligatures, meaning you can turn these on to be extra fancy, and that's a good option for headers and pull quotes. There are also small caps, which make abbreviations look good. So here we see it in the CSS. And this is because they don't interrupt the flow of the sentence by staying at the same height as the lowercase letters. And then we also have old-style numerals. You'll see it in the 1778. These gives you numbers that go below the baseline, which is similar to the way that you make numbers when you write them by hand, and it has the added benefit of making your text more legible. This last one, these are called swashes. You see it on the A. These are just kind of for making things look fancy, so for things like headers and article titles. So when you put all these things together, you end up with subtle changes that make users feel good. These things are really easy to turn on. They're ultimately just CSS properties. I've left them unprefixed just for brevity. But the challenging part is knowing what your typeface even supports, which you can figure out with a variety of methods. So the first is typekit. If you're serving up a font from typekit, it will list those features. Once you've created a kit on typekit, you can see the typeface features that the typeface supports by clicking on the little question mark. The only problem is you kind of need to already know what these things mean. For Google fonts and for fonts that you have locally on your machine, you have to do a little more digging to figure out what features the typeface supports. So in these instances, there are OpenType sandboxes. The sandbox I'm using here, there's a URL right there. And I really like this one because it makes it super easy just to click around and see what things are supported. So we see that it has certain ligatures. If you click something and nothing happens, it just means that that particular feature is probably not supported by that typeface. And then the last challenge is discovering additional glyphs that a font file might contain, since we know from this tweet that sometimes there are additional characters and glyphs that you can't access without key commands or help from some sort of visual editing software. So to find these, you have two options. So the first is to use either FontBook or Character Map if you're on Windows. And then the second is if you have a spare $600, you can get Adobe InDesign. Yeah, I know. So I normally end up using FontBook. If you want to see all the glyphs in your typeface and you have it locally on your computer, you can use FontBook. And you can toggle this option in the upper left to see all the characters in the typeface. Here I'm just going through and looking at all these things that are in this typeface Helen does. So look, we see it supports all these ligatures. It has fractions. It has like all these cool extra things that you might not know about otherwise. So the way that you do it in Adobe InDesign, if you have it, there's actually a glyphs panel in which you can see the entire fonts, all of the glyphs within the typeface, and it will give you their Unicode mappings. So the workflow that I normally have for playing with a new typeface is that I typically use an OpenType sandbox to discover the CSS features the typeface supports, and then I use FontBook to discover the glyphs I want to use in my designs. So for example, if you're on a Mac, the system font is San Francisco, and it has lots of fun little wingdings, including nicer punctuation to replace dumb or straight quotes. Whoa. So FontBook is also a way using the information panel to see what languages a typeface supports, which is good information if you're building a site that needs to support different character sets or languages with lots of accents, like Portuguese. All right. So, yeah. Let's talk performance. All right, so at this point, you've learned about type features, you know where to find them, you know how to turn them on. You might have already formed some opinions on what are the things that you want in a typeface and have some opinions on what you looks good. And at this point, we're just going to pretend you have typeface and you want to load it and you want to use it on your site. What about performance? So obviously, as web developers, we care about performance. You don't want a large web font slowing down the load time of your site badly. At the very beginning of this talk, you might remember hearing me say, like, content is the most important thing, or content is king. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go through these performance tips, as it is the driving philosophy behind what we're doing. So Chris Manning put it best in his article on font loading techniques. He said, readable content trumps custom fonts. So if you've ever loaded in a web font from Google Fonts, you've probably copy and pasted their suggested import code, and it looks something like this. Or like this. And these methods get the job done, but we can definitely improve on them. For one, they can cause a flash of unstyled text, which is called the FOUT. Even worse, they can cause a flash of invisible text, which means you can't even read the content before it's all loaded. FOIT. I tried. If you're on poor Wi-Fi and you're just trying to read something, it's safe to say that a flash of unstyled text is a better experience than not being able to read something at all. Thus, when we're working with WebType, we want to allow for flashes of unstyled text to happen, and then we want to mitigate and minimize their effects. So first, we're going to learn how to prevent the flash of invisible text. So the first thing we want to do when we're trying to prevent this is, to load in like a web safe or a system font. You know, like your normal typefaces like Helvetica and Arial, the standards. So we're going to declare a web safe font first in our stack, and then we're going to use JavaScript to load in our web font once it's ready to use. So for these examples, I'm going to be using a typeface called Calendars Plus, because it's pretty. So here, first we're just loading in Calendars, and then We're first declaring our web font stack first on the body, and then we have this new class that says fonts loaded, in which we're loading the font family that we actually want. We're going to be using a small library produced by Bram Stein, who works at Typekit, named the Font Face Observer. So in this code, first we start with an object that has different families in it. Right now it only has one with a couple of different weights. And we can append later with different families if we wanted to load in more fonts. So first we create a new font face observer for each family in the object, and this will return a promise that gets resolved if the font is loaded or rejected if the font's failed. And in the promise below, we handle those two use cases. So in the event of the promise being fulfilled, we add the fonts loaded class, which will trigger that typeface getting applied to our text. And then we apply that calendars plus typeface that looks so nice, and otherwise we just log and say the fonts aren't available. So we end up with something like this. So there we go. We saw that there was a moment before it loaded. So we can do better. We want to next manage that flash of unstyled text that we see between like the the serif font and the calendars. And so to do this, we're going to compare the font we have with the font we want when we're choosing our stack. So this trick comes from Tim Brown, who explains the philosophy by pulling a quote from Jason Santamaria's book on Web Typography, who says, "The thing I try to avoid most in my designs is not fout, but a jarring shift in the layout when a web font finishes loading. This shift is usually due to sizing discrepancies between your layout and system fonts and your web font." So the way that Tim Brown handles this is by matching his fallback font and his intended web font's X heights and widths. So a typeface's X height is this purple line that you see. That's the height of the lowercase letters, and width just being the literal width of the words when they're laid out in a line. So in these examples, if you remember, we're using calendars plus, and then the closest web font that I could find was Georgia. And right now they're both at 36 points, and the way that we compare them is we literally just put them on top of each other. When we overlay them, we can see that Georgia is both taller and it's wider than calendars plus is. So we're going to bump down Georgia to 35 points instead of 36. And when we overlay them, we see that we end up with a better result. So they have more similar X heights and they have closer widths. It's not perfect, but it's closer. And so when you load that web font, your type isn't going to move around as much. As Tim Brown says, the style doesn't matter so much. It's that it has to flow the same way, because you don't want to interrupt people as they're reading an article. So this means we need to change our CSS a little bit. So on our body, if before you might remember we only had serif declared, now we have Georgia and then serif, and we're now declaring our font sizes. So on our body, we want a font size of 35 points, and on our fonts loaded, we have a font size of 36 points that will not work because I misspelled font size. Sorry about that. So if you're loading a typeface from Typekit or from Google Fonts, this will get you pretty far. Already you know how to circumvent the most annoying things that can happen, which is the flash of invisible text with a lazy load so that your readers can actually read your website. And you get a nice web font, and we know how to make sure that this load isn't disruptive to the reader experience, but we can still improve on this. But wait, we can do more. So Zach Leatherman from Filament Group shows us that we can get even more granular with our lazy loading. So splitting up the normal or Roman typeface with its italic and bold versions. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the browser's faster built-in algorithms to italicize and bold our typeface, and then we're going to lazy load the proper italic and bold versions of our typeface. He calls this FOFT, or flash of faux text. And this makes it like the third FO something T acronym for your vocabulary. There are a lot of them. So the way that Zach handles this is using a font face onload polyfill he's created, which executes a callback when the web font loads. So to use this, we're going to load the font face onload library, and then we're going to set our loads to happen in stages. So stage 1, we're going to load the normal version of the typeface. And then in stage 2, we're going to load its proper italics and its proper bolds and its proper bold italics. So for these examples, we're going to use a typeface called Proxima Nova, which has a lot of different weights. and it would be nice to lazy load them over time. So here we're loading the Roman version of our typeface first, and on completion of that variant, we have 2 more checks for the bold and light versions of our typeface. If those succeed, we add another success class to the top element of our page, so the CSS knows to apply the correct font file. So you'll see in the comments I have stage 1 complete, Proxima Nova loaded, so that's what we were doing before, and now we sort of have a success counter, and we load in a new class. So first we load in our web font using this is our CSS. First we're going to load in our web font using an @font page declaration. You'll see that we're doing this 3 times over for like regular, light, and bold. And the reason we're doing this is because if we group them together, they're going to create that flash of invisible text that we're trying to avoid in the first place. And browsers are also smart enough to not download an @font face until a class exists in the DOM tree that has that font applied to it. So we don't need to worry about these being downloaded and slowing down render. So first, we declare our web save fonts that most closely match our desired font, like we did before. The closest I could find to Proxima Nova was the Mac System font San Francisco, but system fonts on Windows and Linux didn't match as closely, so instead of having the traditional system fallbacks of Sequoia UI and Tahoma for Windows and Linux systems, I'm just setting Helvetica and then a sans serif. So next we set a loaded class named Proxima Nova Loaded, which is where we set our desired web font. So far so good. This is all stuff that you've seen before. And then the new stuff, this is our Proxima Nova B class, the class our JavaScript sets when the italic and bold versions of our typeface have loaded on the HTML element. So we have to refine where the instances we want italics and bolds to load since we've stripped them out completely. So hence resetting italics on emphasis elements and resetting bolds on strongs and on our headers to use the web font's true bold and italics instead of the browser's algorithm version. So all of these strategies have the potential to time out after a period set out by the browser, but that's okay because at least your content loads. So to wrap up this, there's a talk by Kenneth Ormandy that's really wonderful on Web Typography, and he tells this story about the printing press, just like I did, but his is 100 years after Gutenberg and the story we covered. So it's 100 years after the printing press has been made, and there's this man named Pierre Holten, and he's trying to recreate Gutenberg's greatest accomplishment, which was printing the Bible. But Holten's reasons for doing this are a little different than Gutenberg's. Gutenberg just wanted to be able to print the Bible, but Holten wants to print a mini Bible. And that's because Holten is a Protestant and he's living in Catholic France where he can be persecuted for being a Protestant. And so he is struggling. He can't carry around his big Catholic Bible or his big Protestant Bible to worship and get caught. And so do you want to know what his solution was? It was to make a better printing press. It can seem really obvious when you say it like that. Of course it was to make a better printing press. But I think it extrapolates to our challenges with web fonts. So as of last week, the HTTP archive had a chart that's saying that 63% of websites on the web load in a custom font of some sort. And this to me shows that we want to use custom fonts. We just haven't figured out that efficiency part yet. We're still lugging around oversized Catholic Bibles, and we need to learn how to downsize them. And that isn't to say that things won't change and that we can't build better printing presses one day. So I think as developers, sometimes we can over-execute on our ability to do our job. We optimize everything instead of thinking about trade-offs and the things we lose by optimizing everything. So instead of letting performance dictate design, I wonder if we can build great designs that are performant. And I wonder how we can make technology that supports the kind of designs that benefit our users. So I don't have answers for these questions. I think they're purposefully open-ended. They're not even questions necessarily for just us and the people in this room, but I think they're questions for everyone who builds websites and cares about their users. We've decided as an industry, based on those HTTP archive numbers, that we want web fonts. So how can we make better printing presses? All right, so stuff for you to follow up this talk with. If you want to learn more about type, I highly recommend Ellen Lupton's book, Thinking with Type. If you like to sweat the small stuff, this is the book for you. If you want to make working with OpenType easier, I highly recommend Kenneth Ormandy's Utility OpenType and Normalize OpenType projects, which both work to make working with OpenType easier. If you want to learn more about progressive type loading techniques, Zach Leatherman's research is really fabulous. He has ideas for how to get even more performant with data URI techniques that I didn't cover here, so that's worth looking at. And then, if you think that reading about typography is kind of cool, please follow me on Twitter at Helen B. Holmes, where I'll be releasing a version of this talk as a blog post, and be on the lookout for an article I'm writing, All Typefaces Have Histories, which is a sort of a follow-up to this talk about how the typefaces you choose invoke certain feelings for your readers based on where those typefaces came from. And then, lastly, thank you so much to BrazilJS for having me.